This is Generous Theology. Chuck and Brock discuss Dr. James Riley Estep Jr.'s second chapter, What Makes Education Christian? From the book, A Theology for Christian Education.
All right. Here we are again, Chuck, with another chance to talk about interesting topics in theology. Some areas that are really close to your heart have also been on my mind as well. And if it's okay with you, I said in the pre-start to our session here that I had something I was going to hit you with cold, and I hope it's okay and we can roll with the punches here. But I also know that it's something that you've expressed as a passion of yours, and I don't think it'll be completely cold, but I did receive my order of a book called A Theology for Christian Education. It's a series of essays edited by Greg Allison and has other contributors as well. And if it's okay with you, Chuck, I wanted to just talk about some of the issues from that work. And I was looking through chapter 2 in there, What Makes Education Christian? And the essay is by James Riley Estep Jr. And he brought up some points that I just wanted to bounce off of you and get some reactions, some of your own thoughts, maybe some of your own backstory or ways that you've come about thinking about what's the right way to proceed with a Christian education. What does it mean in this day and age? And what are the challenges that it faces? Those kinds of things. I don't think we have to solve anything. I just wanted to do a brief overview to try to set some distinctives using this essay from Estep and picking your brain on. He has the duty of having to answer the question, what makes anything Christian? And so, Chuck, why don't I just throw that over to you and hit you with the correct question up front, and then maybe we can go into more if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yet you're right that Christian education is in many ways a passion for me, in part just because of the household in which I was raised. My parents were both educators, taught in Christian institutions. My dad, after a few years as an engineer, went to teach high school science in New Jersey, and then later started the engineering program at Dordt College, now Dordt University in Iowa. And at the time, Dordt was only the second Christian college or university with an engineering program. LeTourneau University had one at that time as well, but it was just LeTourneau and Dordt outside of the university system. And then my mom also was first a teacher. She taught third and fourth grade, and then later an education professor, and just all sorts of family members. My wife was a teacher. I've got a brother who was a teacher, uncle, and numerous cousins. And now my daughter is in her senior year in college and planning on going into education as well. So yeah, it is something I've thought about a lot as well. What does it mean to do education in a Christian way? And I think one thing I'd be interested in hearing what Estep and the other folks who might be in the book that you point out some of the things that they might say. But there are some really interesting things that we can talk about in that regard, including how do you integrate faith and education, and what's a good way to do that, and are there certain areas, there are differences, I think, of opinion between people and exactly what is the purpose of a Christian education? Is the purpose primarily to protect a child from the outside world? Is it to prepare them for service in the outside world? And then also a little bit, how do we think of our children in a Christian school? Do we see them primarily as people that need to be converted, that need to become Christians, or do we see them as covenant children who we believe to be part of a covenant family? And then I think those answers, and I think people who are good Christians can come to different answers on some of those things, but the way we answer those questions certainly impacts how we do education, especially, and I'm especially thinking of at the elementary and secondary level, certainly impacts things up at the university level as well. But those are some interesting topics that come out of that.
Yeah, good ideas here with that, Chuck. And I'm going to get into that. I'm going to get into Estep's main thesis here that he's leading off with. But just before that, I want to just maybe point out that the ground that Christians in the United States, let's just say, are sitting on, the ground that we're sitting on has changed significantly in our lifetimes. So maybe I would characterize it by saying that we Christians, monopoly seems a loaded word, But a generation ago, Christian education was not the only game in town, but it was just presumed to be the cultural milieu. We can say that in significant ways, as a very Christian nation, and you just had an expectation that it was very important. You started with the presumption of its importance. And the challenges, of course, the challenges go back much further than this. We see educational challenges to Christianity from the secular side of the Enlightenment all the way back the last 250 years or so. But in our generation, it seems like those challenges have had the most noticeable or visible impact. And so now, even before we get into this idea of having a Christian education, we find that we have gone from a situation of being just the default assumption or presumption in the culture to maybe having to explain and sell Christian education. And I don't mean that in a crass way, but I do mean that in the sense that we're in a bit of a new state here. We have to make a case in the marketplace of ideas. We have to answer folks who have competing thoughts about educational philosophy. And we have to win hearts and minds, I think, in a way like never before. Whereas maybe before, there was just a sort of level of, because Christianity so permeated the culture, and there was just a default peer pressure to make sure your children went to church, to make sure your children were educated in the fundamentals of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I still think all those reasons are good, but I think we're in a culture now that needs to be resold on the idea. Do you agree? Is that a good way of characterizing this? What else do you think characterizes maybe our lifetime and how things have developed?
It's interesting because I think I understand where you're coming from on those things. I do come from the subculture of Christian education that has for many years argued that this idea that there's a typical education out there in the world, often expressed in public schools, that is a generally Christian education, that really fought against that idea and argued that there was a need for distinctively Christian schools that taught in distinctively Christian ways. And for example, the school that my kids went to, all three of them K through 8, and the older two also went to high school there, was already formed in 1898. And while back in 1898, when Sheboygan Christian School started, there was a part of the basis for starting that was somewhat language and cultural oriented. The school taught in the Dutch language for the first 30, 40 years of its existence. And that was the only opportunity that Dutch Reformed kids in Sheboygan had to go to school in the language that they spoke in the home. But beyond that, there really was the thought that even if they were English speaking and were able to engage in that way, that there was a need for distinctly Christian schools. And this concept actually came, there's an organization called Christian Schools International. It's one of a couple of large organizations of Christian schools in North America. And CSI primarily originated in that Dutch Reformed community. And you have a lot of schools, the original schools in that organization really were formed between about 1875 and 1900. Sheboygan Christian just being one of them. And the history of that actually was Abraham Kuyper, who we've talked about before. He was a theologian, a politician, a journalist, a pastor in the Netherlands. Abraham Kuyper, when he came to the United States in the 1880s, he gave a series of lectures, including the Stone Lectures at Princeton University. But as a result of that, he also gave a number of lectures around the United States in support of a distinctly Christian education along the lines of what they were doing in the Netherlands at the time, which is in the Netherlands, there was something that was called pillarization, where each pillar of society, and in the Netherlands, it was Roman Catholic, Reformed, and secular or liberal, basically the sort of the followers of the French Revolution. Those were the pillars of society, and each had all of their own institutions. They had their own newspapers, they had their own political parties, and they had their own schools. And so in the Reformed pillar, they had created a series of Christian schools that were separate from the government schools that were supported by parents. And that system was very much encouraged to be started in the United States. And so that's those schools that are now part of CSI, that's their heritage. And so for a long time, you had had these schools, and they still run in this way, that you can't really call them parochial schools because they're not run by the church. There was very much a belief that the church was one sphere in society and education was a different sphere. And so the church shouldn't actually be running the schools, at least at that level. There were different discussions about that at what would happen at the seminary level. And instead, what would happen is you would have parent-run associations that would run those schools. And that's what you still see today. There are hundreds and hundreds of those schools around the United States and Canada that are these parent-run organizations, not necessarily parochial. In fact, I know of one school that calls itself name of town public Christian school, because the idea is that while they're not part of the government school system, they were open to the public, and it was just that it was taught, you were taught out of a Christian framework there. So given that history, it's interesting then, where I grew up in Northwest Iowa, you had, in some ways, you've described, I think, a change that has happened in the last number of decades, where American culture has lost its sense of being a particularly Christian culture, whether that particularly Christian culture was really a distinctive culture or whether it was some kind of a syncretism, Christendom, rather than a distinctly Christian system. But in any case, Christianity had an impact on that. And in the areas where I grew up, quite frankly, a lot of the supporters of the public school system, many of whom were Reformed Church in America folks, as opposed to the Christian Reformed Church in North America folks, would argue that, hey, these public schools are Christian schools too, because the teachers are all Christians, and we pray at the beginning of class. We don't have theology classes per se. We don't have Bible classes, but they're taught by Christians, and the leaders of the school are Christian. And there was always an argument that was made by the supporters of the Christian schools that said, no, that's not the way it works. Schools don't become Christian just because Christians and good Christians are teaching in them. They don't become Christian just because you pray at the beginning of class. They don't become Christian just because you can have a baccalaureate ceremony in a church at the end of the year, or because the football team prays before the football game. But there's much more to it, and that Christianity has to influence every single piece of what you do. And it's interesting. So I'll give you a little bit of an interesting story, an anecdote. Back in the mid-'80s, when I was in high school, my dad actually was on the board of the high school. He had been elected to the board, and at some point he was the president of the high school board. And in Iowa, and every state is a little bit different on how the relationship between the public and the private school systems work. But in Iowa, there was a system in which the state of Iowa indicated that any student who lived in a particular school district had the right to have their book paid for by the school district, regardless of what school they were attending, so long as certain requirements were met. And Iowa was not a very pro-homeschooling state at that time, so one of the requirements was that it was actually in a school situation. Homeschoolers didn't necessarily at that time get their materials paid for. But one of the other things is they wouldn't pay for Bible and theology because this was the public school system. And every year, what would happen is the members of the school boards of the non-government schools in the area would go to their local school districts and say, hey, 54% of the students in the school district attend private schools, so 54% of the money for books should go to these schools, and it should be divided between these schools in this way. And the various schools would show up. And I remember one time, this guy wasn't dumb. The superintendent of the public school system in Sioux Center looked at my father and he said, hey, you're coming here asking for this money from the school districts to pay for these books, and you've signed this thing saying that these aren't theological books, these aren't religious. Aren't you the guy that goes around and teachers at science conferences for science educators in Christian schools around the country that talks about how all of life is religion and you can't separate religion from Christianity, therefore we shouldn't be paying for any of your books. Isn't that correct? And I don't know exactly how my dad answered that question. I think he probably answered it with something along the lines of, the courts have decided that you do have to pay them as long as it's not theology class. But he might have had to admit that that superintendent, even though he didn't necessarily believe what he was saying, probably had a point, which is an interesting thing. And I think some of those things have maybe changed today as well. But so that maybe is a long way of saying, I think I know where you're coming from, but there is also, I think there are Christian systems of Christian education that would say, I don't know that there ever was a sense that public schools were a Christian system, but rather rather they were a system of schools that was influenced in some ways, more or less, by Christianity. And that's different than a distinctly Christian education.